aware as we approach the whole subject of parenting and parents, it's quite a touchy subject because over the years, different generations have got different ways of bringing up their children. And certainly I was brought up in a particular way which wouldn't fit the current model. And certainly the modern product has a lot more freedom than I would have had as a youngster. However, the Bible is the Bible, and it tells us to think about these issues because they are relevant every single generation. And I read this. I wanted to tell you this first. It's a little bit about how to make your child a delinquent. We don't use that word very often nowadays, do we? Delinquent. But how to train your child to be a delinquent. First of all, when your child is still an infant, give them everything they want. This way, they'll think the world owes them a living when they grow up. Secondly, when they pick up swearing and off-colour jokes, laugh at them and encourage them. As they grow up, they'll pick up other phrases that will absolutely floor you. Thirdly, never give them any spiritual training. Wait until they're old enough and let them decide for themselves. Number 4, avoid using the word wrong. It will give your child a guilt complex. You can condition them to believe later, and when they're arrested for stealing a car, well, society will be against them, and they'll know that, and they'll feel they're being persecuted. Pick up after them. Their books, their toys, their clothes, their shoes. Do everything for them so that they will have experience in throwing all responsibility onto other people. Number 6. Let them read all printed matter that they can get their hands on. And never even think about monitoring their computer or their phone or their TV programs, and let them feast their minds on garbage. Number 7, satisfy their every craving for food, drink, and comfort. Every sensual desire must be gratified. Denial may lead to harmful frustrations. Number 8, give your child all the spending money that they want. Don't make them earn their own. Why should they have things as tough as you did? Oh, and when they start a little job, don't make them pay housekeeping either. And I'm talking about part-time jobs as well. Okay. Number 9, there's only a couple more. Number 9, take their side against neighbours and against teachers and against policemen, and remind them that they have the right to an opinion and that everyone else is against them. Number 10, when they get into real trouble, then make up excuses for yourself by saying, I never could do anything with them. I don't know where I went wrong. And number 11, prepare yourself for a life of grief. The Bible says, honor your father and mother so that you may live long in the land that the Lord is giving you. Paul gives us a little bit of an insight into that commandment when he says in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 1, look, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on earth. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Now, every Christian believer must remember that our life and our personal welfare is an issue and a consequence that is affected by the way that we honour our parents. Children are encouraged to honour their parents in the Lord because the Lord expects it. And by this obedience, we honour him. Now, if we who are children fail to adhere to his command, the result will be that we will rear children that will dishonour us. So there's 2 parts to the 5th commandment. The first is the call to honour parents. And the second is that God is calling parents to be honourable. Parents must first obey the principles that they teach their children, and the children must see these principles as the very fabric that holds the family together. And the old adage that we hear so often, don't do as I do, do as I say. My dad used to say that to me all the time. It might be a convenient cop-out, But what it actually does is plants a seed in your child's mind, and they're thinking there will be a time in the future when I'll be able to behave just as I want without being answerable or accountable to anyone. Now in Deuteronomy, I've got to read this to you. Deuteronomy chapter 11, it says this: "Fix these words of mine in your hearts and minds. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Teach them to your children, talking about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates, so that your days and the days of your children may be many in the land the Lord swore to give your forefathers, as many as the days that the heavens are above the earth." This is talking about a life that is couched in the presence of God, wrapped up in the Word of God, enjoying the will of God and expressing the love of God. We won't reach people and preach the gospel unless we preach it to each other, unless we recount the story to each other and talk about what God is doing in our lives. And that is something that we need to pass on to our children. If they don't hear it, how are they going to pass it on? You see, our spiritual life, it rises or falls on the basis of how the first and second commandments are kept. So Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God," say it with me if you want, "with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all of your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." Now, just as our spiritual life rises or falls on the basis of how we keep the first and second commandments, so a society rises or falls with what we do with the fifth commandment. "Honor your father and mother," says Exodus, "so that you may live long in the land of the Lord your God is giving you." I think it's actually quite interesting, just as an aside here, that in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus links the second and the fifth commandments together when he speaks to the rich young ruler. And he says, "Honor your father and mother and love your neighbor as yourself." I think there's another sermon in there somewhere. So the basic unit of society is the family. If the family falls apart, society will fall apart. Could someone go and get Eddie a drop of water, please? Thank you. It's nothing worse than a dry throat. Anyone else need a glass of water while we're there? Okay, because it's not nice. No, this is this thing that everyone's getting at the moment with the sore throat and everything else. Understand it. So the basic unit of society is the family. If the family falls apart, society is going to fall apart. Now, in our materialistic age, we need to impress on parents there is a real need to provide for our children's spiritual growth, to give them foundations and markers that they will always be able to refer to. Now, I read that in England somewhere, there is a cemetery where two gravestones are side by side. And the first gravestone says, "She died for want of things." And alongside the other stone says, "He died trying to give them to her." And in sort of a laughable and yet tragic manner, these epitaphs suggest the folly of living and working only for possessions. But I think as I read these and I reflect on these epitaphs, they kind of describe the downfall of our society. And our children, they're paying the price for all of that because mum and dad sacrificed their spiritual training in order to provide for the latest fads on the market. Whether it be designer clothes, whether it be a games console, whether it be a new phone, whether it be the latest bike, the different clubs that they go to, Sunday football, whatever it might be that takes priority in their life over and above the spiritual training that they need. Whose responsibility is it to get these priorities right? Is it the kids' responsibility? I don't think so. Now, we have got to be structured and we have to be disciplined, and it is hard. But our children need to learn. They need boundaries. They need discipline. You know, I can remember our eldest boy, and we were attending church, and He was in Sunday school and he promised to be at Sunday school. He was quite enjoying it. And then he was offered, he's crazy for football, soccer, you know, and I never understood it, but he's crazy for it. And he loved Glasgow Rangers, okay? So, and if you've lived in Scotland, you'll think it's bad down here with Arsenal and things. Well, you've seen nothing. And he was mad for Glasgow Rangers, and he wanted to play football for school. And he went along to the training sessions, and eventually he was offered a place on the bench for the second team as a way in. And he came home and he was so chuffed. And he said, "No, I don't suppose you'll let me go because it's on Sunday." And I said, "No, son, you can go if you want. But I thought you made a promise to be at Sunday school." And he went. And I said, "Well, it's up to you. You can either keep your promise or you can go to football. You have to make a choice." And he actually went to school and told the teacher that he couldn't play because he'd already made a promise to be at Sunday school. And he came home and he was so upset and he really had the ump, you know. So I gave him a carrot and I said to him, "Well, you've been honourable and God is honourable too. So I promise you, if you get a place to play next time on a Saturday, I'll buy you your Rangers kit." Now, blow me down in a fortnight, he got a place. And it cost me a fortune. But you see the whole point of this. The whole point is that you've got to have spiritual training. They've got to understand this function, these boundaries, before they go on into life. If we don't give it to them, they will fail. They will forever struggle. And it doesn't matter how spiritual we might be and how disciplined we might be. If they're not getting the training, they will go nowhere. So let's have a first heading, shall we? Parenting by example. Now, Paul quotes the 5th commandment in both Ephesians and in Colossians. And he doesn't hesitate to attach the significance of honourable parents to it. He writes, as we've read, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord." In other words, what he's saying, although I love the word exasperate, what he's actually saying is, don't bore your kids. Show them how real Jesus is. Parents, you see, must exemplify whatever it is they want their children to be. And surely that is to be relevant, effective disciples of Jesus Christ. And there's an important lesson here. Our children, they didn't evolve from monkeys. But monkeys and children have got a very common trait. Monkey see, monkey do. If we are not an example of good values, for instance, our children will most likely not have good values, no matter what we teach them. If we are lazy, guess what? They'll pick that up as well. If we've got no commitment, guess what? They won't have commitment either. In our behaviour, there's a responsibility to guard our children's well-being. How can we offer them a future of honour and propriety and commitment and faith and trust and hope if we can't live that way ourselves? You know, a good indicator to see how well a child is disciplined isn't what they get up to, because mischief is normal and it's good and healthy. It's the way they take a telling. I think that's a really important marker. So let me give you a biblical example. And the example is Abraham, with all of his faults and all the problems of being dysfunctional. And if there was ever a dysfunctional family, it was Abraham's family. He knew that on the basis of his being and his value, God had chose him because he knew that despite all of those difficulties, he would exemplify how his children were to live. And this is really important now, because we know how dysfunctional Abraham was, and certainly in our Bible study we've looked at that at length. But do you realise that Abraham rearing his children to follow God was actually crucial to God's plan to save the world? Sure, he had a promise direct from God in an audible voice. He knew that one day he would be a great nation, but that didn't stop him living life the hard way. And I'm sure that he had real regrets at times over his lack of faith in certain areas. God rewarded him because he learned. But look at his children, Isaac and Jacob and Esau. Now, a closer study of their lives reveals just how dysfunctional they were. But there is hope. And hope is there for us in the message of grace, helping us to understand that God can always use us in spite of us. But that's not an excuse for us to throw caution to the wind and live the way we want to and ignore God's commands. But to remember where true authority lies. Not only does God give us examples through the lives of others, but in his law as well, so that there's no need for speculation. So I want you to look at Ephesians chapter 6 with me, and I want you to read the verses out loud from verse 2 to 4. Okay, and then we're going to go over to Genesis. So let's look at Ephesians 6 then together. Let's read the verses, today's verses out loud. Is that you, Lord? Okay, so Ephesians 6 chapter 2, verse 2. Let's read it together. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Now turn to Genesis chapter 18. I'm going to read this to you. Genesis chapter 18 and verse 18. This is God speaking. How are we doing? Genesis 18 and verse 18. Okay, here we go. Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. So what we see illustrated here for us is that God's future for the world and for history, and that's his story, fulfilled through the life of Abraham, was dependent upon three things. Firstly, Abraham accepting the promise. Secondly, living in obedience to it. And thirdly, teaching it to his children so that they could learn to honor God. Now, in the same way, it's imperative, and I really want you to get this into your soul, it's imperative that we as Christian parents and as a Christian community and as a family of faith understand that we are responsible to exemplify a standard of behavior that our children and our young people can build upon. Substantial foundations that are true markers of faith. You see, the future of our community, the future of society, even the future of the world actually hinges upon how we as Christians teach and give example to our children. So we've got to mentor them. We've got to apprentice our children. We need to teach them how to think and how to behave by becoming vulnerable to them, partnering with them in pilgrimage. Now, this is the stuff that gives us the edge that we need to reach a lost world, introducing our glorious God who is so interested in every single life out there. And being older, by the way, doesn't exempt you from being a child. You are someone's child, aren't you? You know, someone once said, I wouldn't give much for your religion unless it can be seen. Because lamps don't talk, but they do shine. You know, many years ago in communist China, they commissioned an author to write the biography of Hudson Taylor. And the purpose was to distort the facts and present him in a bad light. What they wanted to do was discredit the name of the famous missionary. And as the author was doing his research, he became increasingly impressed by Taylor's saintly character, his godly life, and he found it so difficult in the end because he just couldn't carry the task on with a clear conscience. Eventually, at the risk of losing his life, this author laid aside his pen, he renounced his atheism, he received Jesus as his personal saviour. Because you see, whether we realise it or not, our examples leave an impression on others. You know, your home is the number one influence in the life of a child. The average church has a child for 1% of the time, probably a bit less than that actually. The home has them for 83% of the time, and the school has the remaining 16%. Now that doesn't minimise the need for churches and schools, of course, but it establishes the fact that our home is 83% of our child's world. We've only got one opportunity to see maximum benefit. You know, the Bible, it's full of teaching that about a child's curiosity for learning is aroused by what parents do. Look up with me to Deuteronomy chapter 4. Fifth book in the Bible. If you're not sure, just go to the front. There's contents at the front. They'll find it quicker. Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 9. Okay, Deuteronomy 4 and verse 9. Only be careful and watch yourselves closely so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen or let them slip from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to their children after them. Remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, when he said to me, assemble the people before me to hear my words, so that they may learn to revere me as long as they live in the land and may teach them to their children. We've got to have good memories as Christians. We've got to remember that moment when we passed from death to life. That moment when we met Jesus for the first time. Our life was exposed and we understood that he loved us just as we are. That moment when he said, come on, take my hand. And we knew that we belonged to him. It might be a long time ago. It might be a distant memory. But it is our starting point of life. And it's that moment that helps us live the way that we're supposed to live, and that's what we've got to share with our children. It is a treasure. So they understand that they have got to have a moment. I remember when my children professed faith for the first time. And they came, two of them in particular, came to see me and said, I want to become a Christian. I said, no, you don't. And I gave them all the reasons why they didn't want to become a Christian. And they went days and they agonized with it. Until eventually they said, Dad, I've got to become a Christian now. And that is the point for them. You see, if parents want children to have a healthy respect for God and his authority, we must exemplify exactly that for ourselves. So we've got to get rid of our double standards and we've got to start focusing on what God has called us to be. We've got to readjust our programs in life and we've got to think about our priorities and understand that once we become a Christian, God is our priority. It's not work. It's not anything else. God is our priority. I normally tell people God first, family second, church third. So we've had parenting by example. What about parenting the honourable way? You know, being a parent is a tough job, and I think the hardest job, dare I say it, goes to mums. I think mums have a really tough job. I would never want to be a mum. Not so much the having the baby bit. I don't think that'd be pretty awful as well. But I think bringing children up is a constant frustration. And I read this and I thought you'd appreciate it. How to bake a cake with a toddler. Preheat the oven. Get out utensils and ingredients. Remove all the blocks and the toy cars from the table. Grease the pan. Crack out the nuts. Measure 2 cups of flour. Remove baby's hands from the flour. Wash flour off the baby. Remeasure the flour. Put flour, baking powder, baking powder and salt in a sifter. Then get the dustpan and brush up the pieces of the bowl the baby knocked onto the floor. Go and get another bowl. Then go and answer the doorbell. Return to the kitchen, remove baby's hands from the bowl, wash baby, and then answer the phone. Return. Remove pile of salt from greased pan. Look for baby. Grease another pan. Answer the telephone. Return to the kitchen and find baby. Remove his hands from the bowl. Take up a greased pan and find layers of nutshells in it. Head for baby who runs away, knocking bowl off the table. Wash kitchen floor, table, walls and dishes. Call the baker and lie down. I thought that's just standard, isn't it? And you know, when the men come home and you suddenly got all that frustration blows down there, what have I done? You know, and so you get a wall of this. But it's true, isn't it? Being a parent is a hard job. And we laugh at all these familiar scenarios, but life isn't always like that. Although when it is, our children learn from the way we respond to it, and even about when we laugh about it afterwards. And I was thinking about one of our grandsons at the moment, and he's getting to the stage when he's really enjoying stories. And his dad was telling him what he did when he was a baby. And of course, he doesn't remember. And he keeps saying, Dad, tell me that story again. Tell me that story again. And it's because of the way the parents were able to laugh about it. He's now building this coping mechanism for himself, and he's developing quite a sense of humour. This is the way to be honouring, isn't it? It's about engaging in real life and helping our children to understand they are part of real life. But you see, God is only interested in what you have, not in what you don't have. So don't pretend, just be yourselves. He wants us to be the very best that we can be. But he wants us to be honest about our limitations. And he expects a consistency that reveals just how honest we really are. You know, in Colossians, Paul says, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Father, do not, he uses the word, embitter your children, or they'll become discouraged. You know, the surest way to embitter or exasperate or disillusion our children, the surest way to make them sour or stale or cynical is to say one thing and do another. Forever laying blame and never giving any praise, by being inconsistent and unfair in discipline, by showing favoritism, by making promises and never keeping them. Now, I read this little article, What's Wrong with Grown-Ups? And it was a bunch of 10-year-olds in the class were asked, what's wrong with grown-ups? And this is what they wrote. It's quite telling. Grown-ups make promises, then they forget all about them, or else they say it wasn't really a promise, it was just a maybe. Grown-ups don't do the things they're always telling children to do, like pick up your things, or be neat, or always tell the truth. Grown-ups never really listen to what children have to say. They always decide ahead of time what they're going to answer. Grown-ups, they make mistakes, but they won't admit to them. They always pretend that they weren't mistakes at all, or that someone else made them. Grown-ups interrupt children all the time and they think nothing of it. If a child interrupts a grown-up, he gets a scolding or something worse. Grown-ups never understand how much children want a certain thing, a certain colour or shape or size. And if they don't admire what you're liking, even if the children have spent their own money on it, the parents always say, I can't imagine why you want that old thing. Grown-ups sometimes punish children unfairly. It's not right if you've just done a little thing wrong and grown-ups take something away from you that means an awful lot. And then other times you can do something really bad and they say they're going to punish you, but they don't. You never know, but you ought to know. That's coming from a 10-year-old. And grown-ups are always talking about what they did and what they knew when they were 10. But they never try to think what it's like to be a 10-year-old right now. You know, to be honourable doesn't mean that we or our children will be perfect. Honour has to do with how we deal with the imperfections in others and in ourselves. And do you see the link with honesty there? You see, honour allows us and others to learn from the mistakes and decipher what is important and what is not in our relationships. It's about priorities and values. Now, one great story I picked up on this was on the Titanic when it hit the iceberg and it was going down, and they got everyone to the lifeboats, and the wealthy were in their boats first. And one very wealthy lady asked if she could go back to her cabin, and of course a member of staff didn't want to argue with her and let her go. And the ship was beginning to list quite badly, and there was water everywhere, and she went through the gambling area and she was ankle deep in money. She finally got to the corridor where she got to her cabin, and all her jewels, diamonds and all sorts were laid out. And she picked up 3 oranges instead and took them back to the boat. An hour before, she would have naturally have chosen her diamonds over oranges. But in the face of death, her values are seen more clearly. Now, I wonder how much we value our children. I'm not questioning how you value your children. But you know, when we see them as beyond value, if we see them as the most precious thing we've ever had, ask the questions. What do we value as parents? What do we value as disciples? Is our relationship to our children an honouring one? Do we set a good example? And when we fail, are we really honest about it? Are we consistent in our discipleship? Do our children or our young people in the fellowship know that we love Jesus and that we would go to any lengths to serve him and build his church and protect his community? Are we partners in pilgrimage, or do we think that we've arrived and others have got to struggle in just the way that we had to? Well, the questions and the statements, they go on, but the instruction is clear. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honour your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy a long life on earth. Fathers, don't exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. See what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called the children of God. And that is what we are. Shall we pray?